Hello everyone. We are going to have this talk with Antony Loewenstein, an Australian journalist who writes books about the war on drugs, against drugs, and also about Israel to Palestine earlier. Hello, Antony.
Hi, Andres. How are you?
Well, like what you like to say, still alive.
Still alive.
Still alive.
Difficult days in your country, and maybe not quite as difficult for Australia, but for the world, it's not a good year.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes. Jakarta is still pretty in bad shape.
Yeah.
Debt is rising. But Anthony, let's start about this conversation about your work, about your book, and about yourself. Please tell me first about who you are and why you this book on. I read it on my Kindle about the drugs.
So I've been a journalist for about 20 years. I've been an independent journalist for over 15. And in that time, I'm from Australia. So I've been based often in Sydney. I've also been based over the last 10 years in South Sudan and also Palestine in East Jerusalem until earlier this year. And I always see my work as being critical of power. That could be business power, government power, corporate power. And that's been related to a variety of issues over the last 15 years, either through books or films or features in newspapers and online. That's including Israel-Palestine, repressive regimes, and the way in which the internet can be used to challenge that power, and also how it can be co-opted by the most powerful, as we're seeing now with Facebook and other tools. And another big theme of my work has been disaster capitalism, so people making profit from misery, essentially. And I've done a book and a film on that in the last years. And really that has been related to questions of, for example, who make money from war? Who makes money when the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq? Who makes money after there's a natural disaster in, say, Haiti? There was an earthquake there 10 years ago. Who makes money, for that matter, in the tsunami in Indonesia and elsewhere? I'm not saying that the sole purpose of people going to help is to make money. It's not. But there are definitely individuals and groups that do. And I think that problem is getting worse. And Israel-Palestine, I'm Jewish, although I'm atheist. I call myself an atheist Jew. And for people who might not know what that means, that's probably a strange term in Indonesia. But in the West, that's quite common, for Jews at least. I'm not religious. I don't practice my religion. But I feel culturally Jewish. And of course, traditionally speaking, most Jews have a real support and affinity for Israel. I'm the opposite of that. I'm deeply critical of Israel. I've written 2 books about it. My next book, which will be out in 2 years, is also about Palestine. And why? Because I'm deeply ashamed and outraged by the way Israel routinely on a daily basis abuses, kills, occupies Palestinians. And I think it's important that a lot of people realize, not just in Indonesia, but globally, that there are growing numbers of Jews who think this. There are growing numbers of people in general, of course, but I'm talking about Jews per se, because when I was in Indonesia, I was actually at the Ubud Writers Festival a couple of times about 10 years ago. And one of the times after Ubud, I went to Aceh as part of the tour. People in Indonesia will know this, but around the world, maybe not. Aceh, of course, is a Muslim majority part, fairly conservative for a range of reasons on lots of issues, and not that many. Well, there's a presumption when I went there, and I wasn't there solely talking about Israel-Palestine, but I met people there, and I've written about this, and people can Google it. I was interviewed by the Jakarta Post and other publications, essentially saying that I met people there, Muslims, of course, who didn't know that it was possible for a Jew to be anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionist meaning that you don't believe in the concept of a Jewish state because it, in my view, oppresses Palestinians. And I think some people there, their minds were blown. They were like, this is not possible, and because the media that they were consuming, both Indonesian media and global media, normally portrays Israel as a very powerful state, which it is, but as Jews in general are supporting that state uncritically. And although many Jews do, growing numbers of Jews don't. So I was just living there for the last 4 years, reporting from there, And the situation is
Jerusalem, isn't it?
in Jerusalem, indeed. I was there. I'm now back in Sydney, Australia, but I was in Jerusalem, yes. And there's finally, so the drug book. So my drug book, the Pills, Powder and Smoke book, I guess the reason I wrote that really was because I felt that one of the key issues I had not examined in much of my work was the drug war. The drug war is arguably one of the most destructive wars of the last half century. It's killed millions of people. It costs billions of dollars every year. And the aim of people who push the drug war, whether it's in Indonesia or the US or elsewhere, is our aim is to end drug use or at least reduce it, get rid of drug pushers, drug dealers, drug cartels, and somehow have a much nicer, calmer, cleaner world. I mean, that's the general theme. The truth is that the opposite has happened. The drug use has never been higher. Drug abuse has never been higher. I'm not talking so much about Indonesia here, but around the world. But Indonesia, I know, has a very harsh policy, which we'll get to. But I felt also just finally that there's a real connection between the war on drugs and the war on terror. And I'm a journalist who I was born 45 years ago, but my journalism was born post 9/11. Post the war on terror. And the war on terror, the rhetoric around the war on terror is very much about saying, we're going to go after terrorists wherever they are, apparently, and kill them, disable them, kidnap them, torture them, and somehow that will reduce terrorism. And in fact, the opposite has happened. Terrorism has never been stronger than it is now in many parts of the world. And the drug war is the same. It's self-perpetuating. It can never end because terrorism will never end. It can never end because drug use will never end. I mean, that's the internal logic. And since 9/11, many US institutions that are central to the drug war have tied themselves to the war on terror, as I investigate in the book, because they say, well, all these terrorist groups around the world, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, others, Hezbollah, Hamas, are funded and fueled by drugs. And to some extent, some are. But this idea somehow that you can fuse the drug war and the terror war and therefore end both terror and drug use is absurd. But often facts don't get in the way of this reality. So yeah, it's been an interesting 5-year process doing the book.
The next question should be, there are so many policymakers involved here. Politician, general, police, military general, think tank. Why they got it so wrong?
I can speak less about Indonesia and more beyond. I only say that because I didn't go to Indonesia for this book, although I know the situation there relatively well. Very harsh drug policies, very extreme, that have killed many Indonesians and, of course, foreigners, including from my country, Australia. Why have they got it wrong? They've got it wrong because a few reasons. One, expressing an alternative view is seen as risky, both politically and within the media. If you come out and say, for example, as I do, and growing numbers of politicians do, although not, I sense, in Indonesia, we should legalize and regulate all drugs. I'm not talking just about cannabis, talking about all drugs. That doesn't mean, as some people will say, well, you want everyone to take heroin, for example. Of course, I don't think that.
Yeah.
I mean that by legalizing and regulating all drugs, you are taking the criminal element out of the equation. So many politicians and those in the media are scared of being too critical of the current drug war because they're worried about being attacked. I think in some countries, including Indonesia, there's an issue of perceived morality or a belief that my religion says that drug use is bad. Whether you're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, whatever. Of course,
wait a minute. In Indonesia, most men do smoke.
Cigarettes.
Yes, or kretek.
Well, that's of course seen
despite what Islam says on smoking.
But then, yeah, indeed. Well, that's obviously that. I don't find that a problem, although I don't personally smoke. But that is somehow seen as an acceptable breach, while smoking cannabis or hashish or using heroin apparently is beyond the pale. So the argument, I mean, the key thing, Andreas, about the drug war is it's always based on hypocrisy. It's always based on contradictions and hypocrisy. So we can try to bring sense into a inherently illogical war. But I think certainly in many countries, Indonesia, much of the Muslim world, there is a sense that, sure, many people in the societies are using drugs, not a majority, but a minority of people, whatever those drugs might be. The state, I think, has a very selective view of that. What I mean by that is, in many countries where drug laws are harsh, generally speaking, the poorest are the ones that are being most negatively affected. Yes, the occasional rich cocaine user in Jakarta maybe is arrested, you tell me, maybe occasionally a rich Jakarta drug dealer who trades in heroin and cocaine is arrested. I'm sure it happens. I'm sure it does. But overall, in country after country after country, including the US, the heart of the drug war, it's the poor that suffer the most. The drug war is a class war, as I say in the book. It's a war on the poor. It's a class war against the poor from the elites. So to change that, to fundamentally question that, means that you need to unpick the reality of how so many societies have developed in the last half century, which is sadly increasingly one based on dominating the poor. Now, it's not as neat as that, of course. And just finally, I'd say from the US perspective, the drug war is very much also a form of imperialism and colonialism in the modern age. What I mean by that is many of the states that pursue very harsh drug laws or take money from the US to pursue those drug laws, I'm thinking here Latin and South America and beyond, Africa, are happy to be US client states. What does that mean? They get cheap weapons, they get police support, they get the backing, and they're often dictatorships. So from a US perspective, it's a very effective way to enforce control. It doesn't always work. There's been backlash, there's been problems, there's been resistance. It's not neat. But from the US perspective, I would say they would argue, those who support the drug war, it's been unbelievably successful. Now, you and I and many people watching this might say, not all, but maybe some, it's killed millions of people. It's costing billions of dollars every year. Drug use has never been high around the world. This has been an absolute failure. Incarceration rates in, I know Indonesia is going up, in the US. During Trump, it's gone down and a bit up again. It depends on what states of the US. But overall, incarceration rates around the world are soaring, particularly in relation to drugs. And yet, many people who push the drug war, if they're honest, will say, that's the point. That's the point. The point is that you have 2.3 million Americans in prison tonight. They're not all there for drugs. They're not all people of color. They're not. But a disproportionate number of people in those prisons in the US every night, roughly 2.3 million people, are there for drug offenses, and usually minor drug offenses, not violent drug offenses. Yes, they may have been dealing drugs. Yes, they may have had more than personal use. But in general, these are non-violent people who in some cases will spend the rest of their lives in prison. And I met some of those people for the book who had been released during the Obama years, which we can talk about later if you like. But it's a really deeply destructive war.
You mentioned 6 countries. You did your reporting in Honduras, Guinea-Bissau, the Philippines, and Duterte, the US, of course, the UK, Britain, and Australia.
Yeah.
Would you please brief our audience on each of these 6 countries? Why you pick them up? Yes.
I'll do it briefly. Honduras, which is a neighbor of the US, it's been one of the key allies of the US for decades. During the Cold War and during Ronald Reagan's dirty war in Latin America, Honduras was a key staging post for America's war against communism. And Honduras has become, one of the most violent countries in the world. One doesn't read about Honduras much in the global media. You read a little bit about it in the last few years when a lot of Honduran refugees were fleeing to try to come into America under Trump's regime and often not succeeding because Trump has been incredibly harsh on the US-Mexican border. But Honduras has become, in the last years, one of the key transit points for cocaine from Mexico and elsewhere, Colombia particularly, into the US. So at one point, the majority of cocaine coming into the US was going via Honduras. And the best way to think of Honduras, it's a narco state. The term narco state, every level of the government is controlled by narcos, meaning drug cartels who are knowingly infiltrating every level of government. And the US knows this. The US doesn't care. It's one of the most violent nations in the world, not just drug crime, but gang-related crime. It was one of the scariest places I've ever been to, apart from Afghanistan, which I'd been to a couple of times in my last decade. And it's a country that's kind of on the verge of collapse because the US has been happy to allow and indulge, and I might add 10 years ago, support a coup, and that was under Obama, the supposed liberal progressive Obama. And I say in the book, as people will know and you will know who've read it, that although, yes, some elements of Obama's policy domestically and internationally were a bit more positive than previous presidents, Obama on the drug war was no saint at all. And Trump, of course, has been terrible too, but that's almost a given. So I wanted to go to Honduras because it's a place that virtually no one reports about. I think it's a key place. Guinea-Bissau, briefly, is a tiny West African nation, former Portuguese colony. And much of the cocaine going into Europe and the UK goes via this tiny country. It's not as violent as Honduras. The violence there is not as extreme. And when you go there, it feels like a very poor tropical country. Its main export are cashews. And again, it's a narco state. The UN has called it a narco state. Philippines seemed like an obvious place to go. Duterte has been in power now, the president, for 4 years. He remains disturbingly popular. No one knows how many people, and this is 99% of people who have been murdered there are poor, how many people have died. The numbers that I keep on hearing are at least 30,000, probably more. And this is people who are predominantly the poorest of the poor in the suburbs, mostly in and around Manila, which is where I spent my time. And the Philippines really was a deeply disturbing place to go, not because I personally felt threatened, I didn't, but disturbing because how popular Duterte has become. And that's not least because he has mastered the arts of so-called fake news, disinformation, misinformation, very effectively weaponized Facebook. For a lot of Filipinos, for those who don't know, for the majority of Filipinos, in fact, the only information they get on their phone, their mobile cell phone, is Facebook. It's all they get. That doesn't mean everything they read is pro-Duterte, but a lot of it is. And if you have no alternative source of information, well, why wouldn't you believe what you're being told? You know, we're cleaning up the streets, we're getting rid of drug crime, we are making Philippines a better place. And there are critics and there are dissidents, to be sure, and I meet some of them in the book. But I thought it was important to go there, being an Australian, although Australia is very different to Philippines, of course, but it was important to go there because what's happening in the Philippines is slowly seeping into more and more countries in Asia. Now, obviously, in general, most Asian countries are very harsh towards drugs and drug users. There are some exceptions, but putting Australia aside for a minute. So I don't think Indonesia, for example, needs lessons from Duterte to how to be brutal about drugs. But having said that, the popularity, what Duterte is doing is not what Indonesia is doing. Indonesia is not killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people in cold blood in the streets every year. They're doing lots of things in other places in Indonesia, which we won't go into now, West Papua, for example. But in general, on the drug issue, Indonesia is already harsh before we even get to the issue of Duterte. But I thought it was important to go there.
You might want to know this conversation between Duterte and Wiranto, an Indonesian general, as well as President Jokowi. He said that he is copying what President Suharto did in the 1980s.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I talk about it a bit in the book. I didn't know that particular quote. I'm disturbed but unsurprised by that.
Yeah.
That, you know, in some ways, what Duterte has done very successfully from his perspective is he has painted himself as the father figure.
Yeah.
is what Suharto did too.
Yeah.
We're the ones who are going to clean up the dirty streets of Indonesia. And if you get in our way, we're just going to have to kill you. It's just how it is. It's the price that has to be paid for a safer country. And briefly, the last three countries, the US, well, the US I had to go to because it's the heart of the drug war in a way, or at least the Western drug war. I also wanted to, I guess, understand how there's a growing movement in the US and much of the West. And this is probably not very prominent in Indonesia, of legalizing and regulating, at least, certainly cannabis. I mean, many people watching this will be aware that many states have now legalized cannabis. It's inevitable that cannabis will be legalized federally. Whether it's a Republican or Democrat president, we don't know, but it's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years, next year, who knows, soon. US, UK will do the same thing. Australia will do the same thing. It feels like a long way away now, but it will happen. And there's also, of course, moves to legalize and regulate in medical conditions psychedelic drugs for depression and other treatments. I'm talking about LSD, magic mushrooms, ecstasy, drugs that many Indonesians may think of as solely party drugs. And of course, they are those too. But in the last years, there's been unbelievable research. And if people don't believe me, they can Google this, of deeply researched scientific work to show that for a lot of people using these kinds of drugs, not at home in a doctor's surgery under certain conditions, can profoundly help people dealing with PTSD, depression, stopping smoking, stopping alcoholism. It's not a magic bullet, but it's remarkable.
Which are they the one that can do this kind of medication?
Say that again.
LSD. What kind of drugs that?
LSD, magic mushrooms, and ecstasy, particularly those three, and ketamine also, and all these drugs in the US, for example, at the moment are largely illegal, but it's very conceivable within 5 years that it will be legal in the US, the heart of the drug war, remarkably, that you would go to a doctor. And if you went to this doctor today, he or she would say, well, what's wrong? And you say, well, I feel depressed, or I'm upset, or I'm self-harming, or I came back from the war in Afghanistan and I'm suffering, or whatever the reason might be. And you'd be given antidepressants, and they might help, but often they don't. What this doctor would potentially prescribe you instead is a treatment at a facility for a week or 2 weeks under controlled environments with a trained doctor, trained therapist, taking ecstasy or LSD or magic mushrooms or some other drug like that. And it's not going to maybe be 100% cure, but for a lot of people who are doing this now, and the studies back this up, it is for some people a complete change of life. They are literally going from people who want to commit suicide to happy to live their life. Again, I'm not dressing up the fact that there aren't still problems with these issues, but the fact that that could be legal in America within 5 years, and that has not been stopped during the Trump years. In fact, if anything, it's just continued. Trump has not stopped that. I mean, he's not probably maybe supportive of that kind of policy, but it's conceivable that'll be legal. And that to me is a really positive sign. So in the US, I wanted to get a sense of who are these doctors pushing this? Why are they pushing this? Why are they challenging decades of orthodoxy, which says these drugs are awful, they're evil, they should be banned, they should be illegal. If kids are taking these in nightclubs, it should be against the law. And it is against the law. It remains illegal. But the dual use of these drugs is really remarkable. So I want to look at that. The UK, just finally, before I get to Australia, the UK is not as harsh on drugs as the US. Nowhere is, really. Although Philippines arguably is more harsh than the US in terms of death toll. But in terms of incarceration, the US, of course, is off the chart. The UK, the drug situation is grim. Drug use is the highest in Europe. Drug deaths is the highest in Europe. Austerity policies, economic cuts to drug and alcohol services has been awful for parts of the UK. And I spent time in certain areas where there's literally generations being lost to drug use and abuse. It's just awful. So that was the UK. And Australia, my birth country, you know, Australia, sadly, on many things is not a leader. I say that as someone, Australia often is a follower rather than a leader, I think. on many issues. Australia, though, was the first country in the Southern Hemisphere to have a safe injecting facility in Sydney, and I spent some time in that for the book. What that means for people who don't know is there's a facility about 20 minutes here from my house. You can go there. You have to bring your own heroin. You don't get provided heroin if you're addicted. You can use that heroin safely. There's people who work there who are watching over you to make sure you don't overdose or die. Nobody has ever died in a safe injecting facility anywhere in the world. Nowhere. And the aim, of course, of this facility is to either, well, save lives. And in the area in which it opened in Sydney, the death rate dived. There's also one now in Melbourne, the southern state here, which opened a few years ago. And that was the second one in the southern hemisphere. Like, my vision would be that every city in Australia would have one, if not more than one. This should be happening across Indonesia, across all of Asia. Now, it's probably hard to imagine as an Indonesian there'd be a facility sponsored by the government to allow people to legally use heroin. But it makes so much sense. By doing so, you're not encouraging people to use heroin. That's an argument used against it. It's not the case. And there's no evidence that, for example, when these places open, everyone starts using heroin. It just doesn't work that way. It's to make it safe. And in fact, across many cities in Europe, across Canada, these places exist, and there are still people who abuse drugs or abuse heroin. So I wanted to examine this about Australia and why there is, as you said before, Andreas, a real resistance in the political and media class to change some of these quite draconian drug laws. Again, I think cannabis will be legalized here. It's not going to be led maybe by current Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who's very much against it, but it'll happen. 5 years, 10 years, when other countries do it. And in fact, it's finally Canada legalized cannabis 2 years ago. It's the first major Western country to do so, and the sky has not fallen in.
Anthony, I'm not familiar with all of those names. LSD, magic mushroom, ecstasy, or heroin, cannabis, marijuana,
Yeah.
and also sabu in Indonesia. Of all of those names that you mentioned, which one is the strongest? And what are the differences between ecstasy, sabu, or whatever?
So some of those drugs you mentioned are naturally growing. So marijuana obviously grows in the ground. I mean, it either grows naturally on the side of a road that you drive past. It could also be, obviously, you can plant it yourself in your own house. Maybe not in Indonesia, not such a good idea, but in general, it can be done. It's a naturally occurring plant. And it's the most commonly used drug by far. I don't know the numbers of people who use it in Indonesia or hashish, but I suspect a lot of people use it. I mean, you tell me. I don't know if you know, but I'd say it's a very commonly used drug in Indonesia.
Hashish is for
exactly
smoke, right? To smoke,
exactly.
And heroin for injection.
Heroin is injecting. You can also smoke heroin.
Okay.
The other drugs, most of them are produced artificially, meaning they're not produced in the ground. They're produced in a lab in whatever. And one of the dangers of so many of these drugs when it's unregulated is you don't know what you're taking. That's the problem. So when you often hear people overdosing on heroin, which happens all the time around the world, it's because when people buy this heroin from a dealer or they buy it online, they have no idea what's in it. And it could be full of impurities, of crap, of whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the idea of a regulated system is that you know what's in the drug. It's safe, in inverted commas. I don't mean that to encourage people, but I mean, you're not going to die from an overdose. Very, very unlikely if you know what's in the drug. Ecstasy is a drug that generally makes people feel euphoric, happy. It's often taken it became very popular in the 80s in the UK and spread around the world. People go to nightclubs, they're dancing, they take ecstasy. It's like a little tablet, essentially. LSD was used very famously in the 60s by a lot of hippies and others as a way to discover alternate realities in your mind, really. Magic mushrooms, the same. Mushrooms also grows naturally, by the way. I'm sure in parts of Indonesia. I don't know where, but I suspect there are places where it's grown naturally. Heroin,
How do you consume it? Eating or
eat it.
eat it?
Or a tea. Often people take it as a tea. They mix it up with a tea. For many, many years, many of these drugs, in fact, to this day, really remained illegal. And the effect of that, this is across the world, and the effect of that has been really destructive, because it's meant that, as in Australia, as one example, I discuss this in my book, in the last years, every summer, there are often young people who are dying from taking ecstasy. They're dying because they take a pill they get from a friend or from a dealer. They don't know what's in it, and they're overdosing. They're taking something which is unhealthy, which is bad. And what many people, such as myself and others, are pushing is that there should be drug testing at a facility, at an event, in a city, meaning that you can, as an individual, without worry of being arrested or charged by the police, go to a shop, to a place, to a facility, have your drug tested to know what's in it before you might take it. And I suppose the underpinning of all this, Andreas, really for me is that I accept and acknowledge the fact that societies and governments can only control and should only want to control so much about what people do in their lives. I don't mean that government should encourage people to take ecstasy. I don't think that for a second. In fact, someone like myself who advocates legalization of all drugs says there should be no advertising at all. Full stop. There's no advertising at all. It should be like what's happening in Australia now with cigarettes, where cigarettes are legally available, yes. They're incredibly expensive. There's no advertising. You go into a shop. I don't smoke, but you go into a shop and there's no discerning feature between company X and company Y.
Yeah.
And the impact of that has been smoking has gone down. People still smoke. In Australia, of course they do, but it's gone down. Something Indonesia should consider. I suspect, considering the rate of smoking, I'm guessing is very high in your country, right? It must be very high.
Government might be toppled for doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so wrong, yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the problems I think that the US model, a hyper-capitalist society, is doing with cannabis is that they are kind of doing the exact opposite of that. They're essentially allowing what used to be big tobacco companies to become big cannabis companies, to advertise, to promote, to make it look sexy. This is a problem. In other words, to me, the education about drugs, a realistic education, not simply just say, no, drugs are evil, drugs will kill you, should start very young, maybe not in kindergarten, but young, when the kids are young, very, very young. A mature discussion about drugs, because today, still, too much of the drug debate at schools, from what I understand, is very much about, don't touch them, they're bad. Well, that's not just failing, it's actually so negligently not working. Drug use has never been higher. Australia has some of the highest per capita drug use in the world. Drug use in the UK is off the chart. Now, obviously, COVID has made some of that a bit more difficult because people aren't going out as much. But putting the COVID issue aside for a minute, COVID will end at some point, hopefully next year. Things will go back to normal, so to speak, at some point. The so-called just say no drug message is a complete failure. So what I would call for is a mature discussion. And also, I should say, for someone like me who advocates legalizing drugs, we're not suggesting it goes from how it is today to legalizing all drugs tomorrow. Of course, that's not the case. It'll be step by step. You start with cannabis. You then move to other drugs. You potentially decriminalize certain drugs first. Some viewers might not be aware that in Portugal 20 years ago, they decriminalized all drugs, every single drug.
Wow.
And they did this in the early 2000s because Portugal at the time had the highest HIV rates in Europe. People were shooting up with needles. HIV was out of control. And the government at the time, which was not radical, in fact, the government at the time was quite conservative, took what was, to some extent, quite a radical decision and said, we're going to decriminalize everything. That includes cannabis, heroin, everything. Now, 20 years on, we have the statistics, and the facts are very clear. Drug use and abuse has fallen. People can Google this if they don't believe me. It's fallen. Now, people still take drugs. People still abuse drugs. Of course they do. But in general, it's gone down across all age groups. And the money that would have been spent on law enforcement has much more now gone to education and health. So basically pick up the people who fall through the cracks, who take drugs for whatever reason there may be. Personal reasons, relationship breakdowns. People take drugs for 1,000 reasons. And to me, the first key step, if you don't as a country want to decriminalize drugs, at least not make it a criminal offense for personal use of drugs. So if you're walking down the street and you have, a gram of cannabis or a gram, in other words, the state decides what is an acceptable amount for personal use, that you'll not be arrested for that you won't be charged for that. I mean, it's absurd. In fact, in many areas of the UK, that's happening unofficially anyway. I met some senior police who said, in our area, we do not charge people if we find them with small amounts of any drug. It's technically against the law. Person X who is found with heroin that they're probably using for themselves or maybe a friend or partner can be charged and probably found guilty for that. But the police are making a decision. They sort of say, what an utter waste of our resources. We don't achieve anything. Drug use is going up, not down. We are pushing, in fact, the more progressive police in the UK, and I feature some of them in my book, are calling for legalization. This is coming from the police, not from so-called radical leftists. I mean, leftists too, but police, because they see the impact of the failed drug war on the streets. Now, I'm not saying all police think like that. Many police are still gung-ho about let's lock them all up and put them away. Okay. But the debate is shifting in much of the West. And to the point where this US election cycle, most of the key Democratic candidates, I have to say, except for Joe Biden, who is now the candidate, but Kamala Harris, certainly, vice presidential candidate, they're mostly calling for at least legalizing cannabis. Like, this is where now Trump might win re-election, and that who knows where that goes. But in other words, this was not happening 4 years ago. This debate has moved so fast, and public opinion in much of the West, whereas 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, the majority of people who are asked, do you support legalizing cannabis? In most Western countries, the majority of people said absolutely not. Now, the majority, not everywhere, most places say yes. They say yes. Now, Indonesia, I'm guessing, will be a bit different to that.
This is a message for our Indonesian audience. Please tweet, please post the term legalize cannabis or marijuana or other things.
Yes, absolutely. Because although it might seem for some people quite a radical idea, I'd say, well, I wouldn't.
Anthony, excuse me. There is one more drug that I'm very curious about.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your book, sabu. In Indonesia, we call it sabu-sabu, amphetamine. Why it is so popular in the Philippines, in Indonesia, Thailand, and many other parts of Asia? And what is it? What is it?
It's basically a very cheap drug. That kind of partly explains. It's cheap. It's a very cheap drug. I've never taken it myself, but it's a very cheap drug. Most people being killed in the Philippines are using that drug.
Sabu.
Exactly. And it's called that there too. So my reasoning or explanation for why so many people take it is, it's literally a way, Andreas, to get through the day. It's literally a way to manage a really tough life. Hard work, poor housing if you even have a house, access to education, all the things that in many people in many of the countries you mentioned have extreme difficulty achieving. This drug, A, it's easy to get, B, it's cheap, it's almost like it numbs the pain. This is what it does. It numbs the pain. It doesn't solve any of the problems, obviously, but it numbs the pain. For example, last year I spent time in Nigeria, Africa's biggest country, to do a film about tramadol. Tramadol is a legal opioid. A woman gives birth, she might be given it after childbirth to deal with her pain. It's a legal drug. But what's happening with tramadol, including in Indonesia and many countries around the world, is it is massively abused in abuse grade strength. So the strength that you would get through a doctor, I'm talking about 4, 5, 6, 7 times as strong you buy on the street from a local dealer. And people are taking that in Nigeria, apart from terrorist groups giving it to their captives. Boko Haram, the terrorist group, gives it to kidnapped boys and girls to give them this kind of inner strength. It numbs the pain. But for the majority of Nigerians who take it, and we're talking about millions and millions of people, and the similar situation with Shabu in Indonesia and Philippines and elsewhere, and people I spoke to would say very clearly, it helps us get through the day. Obviously, extensive use is damaging. It screws you up. It's bad for your health. I'm not for a second encouraging it. But I mean, to be honest, when I was in the Philippines, in Nigeria too, you have a lot of sympathy for people who do it because you see the lives that they have. I mean, manual workers who are spending 12, 15 hours a day, often in brutal heat, doing that day after day after day. And many people might not think about it or know or want to know, but a lot of those people, obviously not all, a lot of those people are taking these kinds of drugs to manage that physically, mentally, to deal with that life. And until societies like Indonesia or others want to deal with the underlying reasons why so many people feel the desperate need for those drugs, making the drugs illegal solves nothing. You can make the drug illegal. It's illegal now. I mean, shabu is not legal in the Philippines. It's used massively, and it will continue to be used massively until there are better jobs and opportunities and education and health. That's why the drugs are popular. And if it's not shabu, it's something else, right? And it's not tramadol, it's something else. They're cheap, easily accessible, and they numb the pain. And I think, to me, in those environments, it makes perfect sense why you would take it. I suspect I would take it too if I was in that space. I'm sure I would.
One of my nephews does it in Pontianak.
Shabu.
Yeah, shabu. He is now inside a rehabilitation hospital in Pontianak. He is a manual labor. When he was a teenager, he was trafficked to work in a palm oil plantation in Malaysia. I always suspect that creates so much trauma in him. Life is quite difficult.
Absolutely.
I guess there are going to be some people working for the UN office on drugs and crime. I know the guy here, the head of the UN office on drug and crime in Jakarta. What should people like me tell them about this drugs policy?
You mean in Indonesia or just in general?
In general, around the world. If you are to meet, in a dinner party, a UN official in charge of drugs, what should we tell them?
I talk about in the book quite a bit about the UNODC. That's the department that you referenced. And in my film for Al Jazeera last year, which is not mentioned in the book, I don't think, but about tramadol, we spent some time with the UN in Nigeria, who were very helpful. So I'm not particularly critical of them there. But in general, historically, the UNODC has been fairly destructive on this issue. What I mean by that is that they have generally been too willing to do a few things. One, to believe that there could be a military solution. Not saying everywhere, but often. A military solution, I use that term loosely, to this problem. Far too keen to use law enforcement as a so-called solution to the drug problem when the evidence doesn't back it up. Yes, the UNODC has often supported rehabilitation, and of course I back that. They should do far more of that. there has been a slow push within the UN ODC system and the UN itself to accept the idea of legalized cannabis. That I think is shifting. I think the real test for the UN ODC in the coming years will be how they respond to the increasing use, whether they like it or not, I might add, to these kind of psychedelic drugs, as I said, LSD, ecstasy, etc.
And sabu, is it included?
No, not so much shabu. I'm talking about, no, I'd say like ecstasy, LSD, magic mushrooms, when those drugs are going to be used probably legally, or even if it's not legal, they're being used now to treat people's depression, to treat people's problems. Now, if you think that the solution to that is to do what? To crack down on those people, to arrest the doctors using those drugs, the UN's position on that is, at least now, as far as I understand it, say these drugs are illegal. Full stop. They are illegal, yes, but they have clear medicinal purpose and use. So to me, the UN system, which, as you would know very well, moves at a snail's pace at best, what has changed in the last years within the UN ODC system is, for decades, the US was the key pusher of these agendas. Hardline, just say no, very violent drug war. Now, the US obviously still pursues that drug war a little bit differently to years past, but they still do, and Trump has accelerated that, especially in South America with Colombia. But there's been a changing of the guard, so to speak, in much of the UN ODC. So the countries that are now pushing a much harsher drug policy is not so much the US anymore. It's countries like Egypt, Iran, Russia, Indonesia, Philippines. Now, it's ironic in a way that they're the countries that are now pushing a harsher drug law when the evidence from within their own countries is utter failure. It's complete failure. Drug use is not going down. Drug use is not going down. Drug incarceration is not going down. You think in the Philippines people are taking less shabu?
Oh
You
my
think
God.
people, I mean, Duterte could argue and says, oh, well, people, we're going to stop here until all, when I met, in the book, the head of the Filipino drug unit saying our vision, because of our president Duterte, is by the end of his first term, which is now 2 years away, all drug abuse will be over in the Philippines. I just heard that and wanted to laugh.
Mm-hmm.
I just said, you can't be serious. Like, are you joking? And he was deadly serious. So I said, okay, how many people do you need to kill to make that happen? Now, that's not about the UNODC, I understand that. But the reason I mention that is the UNODC needs to be far more assertive, pushing back against, that's the case, that's the UN in general, frankly, but pushing much stronger against the countries in which they're arguing these points. It's not simply good enough to say, well, Indonesia has this policy, they're very harsh on drugs, they put people in prison, they execute people. Okay, fine, but you need to push back way, way harder, way, way harder, but also articulate an alternative view. The problem is not articulating the alternative vision, because at the moment the UN does not have consensus what that vision is, which is, I guess, the UN in general, right? The UN can never agree on anything. That's part of the problem with the UN. I mean, I support the UN, but it's a very flawed body, as anyone watching will be aware. They need to look far more seriously at what legalization and regulation means, including in Indonesia. And I'm really hoping that the UN ODC will take that role. But historically, it's not easy to be optimistic that they will. But I would love, Andres, at your next dinner party, if you're meeting the head of the UN ODC there, to say something polite but firm. As we would say here, they need to pull their finger out. You know that expression?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't know that particular person, so I don't know that person. He or she might be a great person. I'm not against that particular person per se. I'm just saying in general.
An American.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure he's great. But I'm saying in general, there's an issue with the way the UNODC has approached this for too long. And the book goes into some detail about why that is.
I read your piece at The Guardian about you having a German nationality, that your ancestors, grandparents, were in Germany during the Second World War. Could you please tell me how did you get that nationality, and how did they move from Europe, Germany, to Australia?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. And so briefly, as I said before, I'm Jewish. And so as a Jew with most of my family in Europe, what happened in between 1933 and 1945, the 12 years of Nazi Germany, was very predictable. Most of my family was killed in the Holocaust, killed in concentration camps, the vast majority, like most Jews. My grandparents on both sides, both my mother and my father, escaped in 1939, just before the war began. And at the time, it was very hard to get out. They ended up getting visas for Australia, which, I mean, Australia was far away from Germany always, but back then, Australia would have been seen as this really weird, crazy, faraway colony of the British. I mean, it's still, I guess, is a colony of the British. That's a separate issue. But anyway, they came in 39, but when they left Germany, Germany said they were no longer citizens. They were non-citizens. I mean, it was not true. They were still Germans, but Germany didn't recognize them at the time. So after the war finished, Germany in the 50s put a law on its books saying that Jews, or close relations of these Jews whose families were said to be non-citizens, could have their citizenship reinstated to become German again. Now, for decades, the majority of Jews around the world did not take this up. Their view after the war, with some understanding, was basically, screw Germany, screw you, screw what you did to us. We don't want your passport. We don't want your nationality. Go away. Now, in the last 10, 15 years, that's radically changed. There are a lot of Jews around the world, including me. And for years, I asked my father and my grandfather's passed away now, but would he consider getting the passport? He had to start that process first. And my grandfather always said, I don't want to get it. You know, I left Germany. I mean, he'd gone back to Germany to visit. But anyway, and then my father for years had a similar view. About 10 years ago or so, I finally convinced my father to do it, and then I got German citizenship. So I am now, although I wasn't born in Germany, I don't speak German. I've been to Germany to visit, but I've never, only been there briefly. I have a German passport. I'm a German citizen, essentially. And I wrote that piece in The Guardian because I'm an Australian citizen and a German citizen. I'm also Jewish, anti-Zionist, atheist. It's very confusing, but I get through my days okay.
Multiple identities.
Indeed, multiple identities, absolutely. And that when I got the passport here in Sydney about 10 years ago, I was actually very moved. I was moved not because I feel German, I don't really, but there was something about Germany closing the circle historically, basically saying, as Germany has done, arguably better than any other country in the world since, I mean, no other country's committed genocide like the Germans. Obviously, there's been other genocides, Indonesia, Cambodia, many other genocides around the world in the last 100 years. But I can't think of any other country, and I'm not saying it was perfect, but any other country more than Germany that has tried to make amends through a range of reasons. Compensation, museums, giving people like me passports, etc. And I really respect that. So it's nice to have an EU passport, which I've used sometimes, and I can give it to my children when I get round to organising it. But there is something, as I said, about rejoining, very far away, but rejoining that country and that community, because frankly, if there wasn't the Holocaust, I'd be living, I mean, who knows, but I'd be a European, I guess. I mean, who knows if my parents would have met, etc. But I'd be in Europe, as would be, I mean, there's only now in the world around 14 million Jews. It's a very small population globally. of which about 7 are in Israel. And most of the other ones are in the US, basically in New York. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but the US. And of course, there are Jews in the UK and Australia and, elsewhere. But in general, it's 2 countries, the US and Israel. And so it's a small population. So without the Holocaust, there would be obviously, who knows how many Jews in the world, but a lot more. And I'm proud of my Judaism, even though I'm deeply, as I said before, ashamed of what, for many Jews, Judaism has become Zionism. Judaism has become uncritical support for occupation of Palestinian lands. And that's something that I can't tolerate ever, because it's shameful. I mean, our history, what Israel is doing is not like the Holocaust. I'm not making that comparison, but what Israel is doing in Palestine is of a brutality which only comes from someone who has not learned from history, who is destined to repeat. It's almost like the abused child becomes the abused adult. Often kids who are abused as when they're kids, drunk father, drunk mother, whatever it may be, drug abusers, often end up being abusers themselves. They repeat history.
Exactly.
And I fear that too many Jews are blind to that now.
Yeah. To what extent this closure help you to become this kind of personality? I would like to say that you are obviously very smart, but also very daring. This is a very difficult combination, smart and daring. To what extent that closure makes you like what you are today?
I think sometimes I'm very much aware that my privilege should be used for good. What I mean by privilege is, I don't mean because I'm a multimillionaire, I don't mean some money sense, but I mean privilege in terms of being a relatively successful person in the West who has a voice. And to me, we have a choice. We have a choice to do 2 things if you have a voice. Whether you're a journalist, artist, lawyer, whatever you may be, human rights worker. A human rights worker is more likely to be public, like something like you do. But we have a choice. We either say nothing, stay quiet, because it's too risky, because it's not worth it, because we might lose a job. I mean, I know lots of people who won't speak out about Palestine who are Jews because they literally say to me, I will lose my wife. I will lose my brother. They don't mean in terms of dying. They mean in terms of the relationship will be severed because you can't have a mature conversation about what's happening in Palestine. So look, me becoming a German citizen, I don't think was the only factor that's made me who I am. I had very supportive parents. I don't know, I was inspired often in the last 20 years by journalists who wanted to give the finger to power, to be honest, that I see less and less journalists doing that. I'm not saying there aren't good journalists out there. I'm the only one who's good. I don't mean that at all. Exactly. There are good journalists in your country, obviously, my country, a lot of countries around the world who are very brave, whether they're online, print, TV, whatever it may be. But the risk is not necessarily just physical, although physical threats against journalists has never been worse around the world, and that worries me. But the risk is not just that, right? It's also a risk that it's much easier to go with the pack. And I see this time and time and time again, that the majority of journalists, in my experience, even though they'll say they're challenging power, actually want to be close to it. I see it all the time. All the time. They don't want to step out of line too much. They don't want to, for example, in one of the key, there's one of the most important media freedom cases in the world happening right now, Julian Assange in London, founder of WikiLeaks. I've been a supporter of them since 2006 when they began. I don't know Julian very well, but I've met him over the years. There can be criticisms of WikiLeaks and Assange. That's to be expected, but they are, to me, inarguably one of the most important news organizations of the last 2 decades. They've released more leaks than any other news organization I can think of. The fact that so few media organizations and journalists will speak out in support of him and them speaks volumes to me about how they see their role. Because they worry if they speak out, they'll be seen as one of the people who supports that guy, someone who's been so tarnished. So I have one foot in the independent world and one foot in the mainstream world, one foot in the Jewish cultural world and one foot in the anti-Zionist world, one foot in, I'm Australian, but I'm often very ashamed about my country, not least its refugee policy, which very much impacts Indonesia. And often I wonder where I belong. I don't think I don't belong here. I don't think I belong in Berlin or in Jerusalem. I don't know. I don't mean that I'm daily tortured by that, but I don't know. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. And I'm happy with that. And I hope that that's always going to be possible. But I'm very aware that more and more this century, I fear that we're moving towards a much more authoritarian state in many countries. And that worries me.
Our time is up, Antony. Thank you so much for the conversation. I wish you the best of luck and stay healthy. Survive.
You too. Keep fighting. Thanks, Andreas. Bye.